Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fensky. Illinois is touting a new vision for juvenile justice. Leaders say the changes they're making will, quote, completely overhaul the state's juvenile justice system in the next 4 years. Are those promises too good to be true? Well, joining us to dissect what's happening and what that means is Duaa Eldeib. She's a reporter for ProPublica, Illinois. So, Duaa, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So how is Illinois planning to reform its juvenile justice system?
So they're really breaking it into 3 phases over 4 years. But I think the biggest change is around the facility where the youth are being housed. So currently there are 5 state juvenile facilities. And they can hold anywhere from, let's say, 50. They're prison-like. Some people just call them prisons. They have, some of them have barbed wire. Their doors have chuck holes, those slots where you can try to, slide a tray of food into the cell. And they're spread across the state. And so this new model really wants to move the youth out of those facilities and into residential centers that'll be smaller and a lot closer to home. The way the state is describing them is, they're using words like dorm-like and bright and calming. But the idea is kind of to get them away from these very prison-like, austere settings and into more residential, home-like facilities that are going to be closer to home. And I think that's another important piece of this. One of the problems that we were hearing over and over with the current model is that they were just really far away from where the children lived before. So some kids, for example,
Duaa, I just want to interrupt here. I'm so interested in what you're saying, and unfortunately, we seem to just have a bad connection here. I understand, Duaa, that you are back with us now. Can you hear me?
I am. I'm so sorry. We did the sound check ahead of time, and I'm just so sorry about that.
You know what? Sometimes people just sound perfect in the sound check, and the minute we get on the air, it's like there's some bad juju that's holding us back here. But you sound great now, and I'm happy to go back to talking about this. So you were describing these jail-like settings. There's 5 of them across the state. Kids were in some cases very far from home. The state is saying they're going to change all that.
Yeah, exactly. They're saying that we no longer want these prison-like settings. We want the goal of juvenile justice is to rehabilitate the youth and to make them, put them in the most comfortable settings that encourage rehabilitation. So the main thing with the reform is to move them out of those facilities and kind of transfer those facilities to the adult corrections and then move them into regional residential centers.
Well, this sounds long overdue, frankly. This is what Missouri has been doing for decades, and we've received a lot of recognition for doing it that way in Missouri, having kids in these residential settings. What is driving Illinois finally doing this now?
Yeah, it's interesting because, when I ask about this, Missouri comes up all the time. They've been doing in Missouri, and Missouri is so great, and look at, Missouri. I think that, this has been years in the making. I think, some may even say a century in the making, since Illinois was, home to the first juvenile court in the country, more than a century ago. And, it's out of this understanding that, children are different than adults. And so when they make mistakes or commit crimes, they shouldn't be dealt with in the same way that adults are. And so that was kind of, the foundation, the basis of this. But then, fast forward to the 90s when Illinois and other states were adopting tough on crime laws and policies. Illinois was locking up some 2,000 juveniles. But then I think there was kind of, the pendulum keeps shifting. And so it kind of swung to the other direction, after that when lawmakers and state officials began to, understand that actually that approach wasn't working. And they started looking at evidence and research, and these dire theories of, youth as super predators never really came to bear. I think that plus brain research that showed that, youth's brain isn't fully developed until their mid-20s. And so they have greater potential for rehabilitation, less evidence of culpability. I think all of that just kind of laid the foundation to, this reform plan now.
So you wrote in your piece about this for ProPublica, Illinois, that when you hear language like complete overhaul, that your reporter radar goes off. What makes you skeptical of what sounds like, frankly, moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think, I'm not a skeptical person by nature, I think, but it's a kind of an occupational hazard. And so whenever I hear, just kind of very sweeping language of reform, I think even with the best intentions, I wonder if they'll be able to pull it off or to pull it off in the way that they want. I think one of the things that has helped Illinois is, it has that political will and sustained leadership. So, I think it's important to remember Illinois didn't have a Department of Juvenile Justice until 2006. So it took time, to kind of change and transition to this more youth-centered approach. And then, after that, Illinois had, I think what also helped is we had two governors, one Republican and the current one Democrat, who has made criminal justice reform a priority. And I think one of the things that I noticed when looking at Department of Juvenile Justice compared, for example, to the Department of Children and Family Services here, which I also write about, is that there's been sustained leadership at juvenile justice. And so, usually when you've got a new governor who comes in, he or she likes to kind of clean house and put their own people in. But we had two governors in a row who either appointed or retained directors of juvenile justice department who were really pushing for these reforms. So, I think that gives me hope. But I think in Missouri you're the show me state, so I've kind of got that built, and I'm like, okay, I'll believe it when I see it.
And yeah, that's, I think, something a lot of journalists learn, like, okay, I'm going to have to be skeptical here, but it sounds like there's also an element of hope in how you're greeting this. I was shocked in reading your story that there's a very small number of kids statewide who are currently locked up in juvenile detention. Is that mostly because of the coronavirus pandemic right now?
Actually, it's been kind of this sustained effort that the department has really been working toward. So we mentioned that 2,000 number, back in the late 90s, and then they were able to bring it down to, maybe 1,000 a decade ago. But even just within the last couple of years, they were going from, 400 to 300. And now they're, around 100. So part of it is coronavirus, but part of it is just really part of this effort to reduce reliance on the juvenile justice system. And that's another part of this reform plan, in addition to just the facilities and moving them, to residential centers, but also reducing reliance on the juvenile justice system and trying to build more community-based services and support for the youth.
It's interesting. As much as Missouri's juvenile justice system is considered this model, there's been a great debate happening in the state in recent weeks where the governor wanted to give judges the option to take kids as young as 12 and put them in the adult system. And now that age, as the bill has been changing, it's been inching up higher and higher. But there's still a lot of questions about when do we put a kid in the juvenile system? When do we treat them as adults? And you've covered this issue in Illinois, where the state was automatically transferring 15-year-olds to adult prison. What did you learn about that policy when you were working on those stories?
Yeah, and that's something, I think as being, neighbor to Missouri, I've heard about a lot in recent weeks, and advocates, really criticizing and balking at that because of the potential, just to increase the number of juveniles in the system. I think what I saw from, my coverage of this issue is it really takes the discretion out of the judge's hands. And, when they're not able to consider mitigating factors like poverty or like, history or, family status, this one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work. And so I remember, interviewing a kid who had just turned 15, maybe just a few weeks before, he had committed this crime. And there was another kid who was, a few weeks younger and had not yet, reach his 15th birthday, and they got markedly different sentences when really you're talking about a matter of weeks. And, again, going back to this idea of, brain development, a teenager's brain is not fully developed at that age. And so when we treat them as adults, there's a real question about, what that means for their ability to be rehabilitated. And then once they're in the system, what that means for their risk of, assault and abuse in the facilities.
You talked to some of these juvenile offenders who were doing hard time in the adult system, and these interviews were kind of heartbreaking. They almost just seemed like lost kids in an adult prison as opposed to somebody that we should be afraid of. Was that your takeaway as you were reporting, or are there some who maybe they genuinely do belong in the adult prisons?
Sarah, I have to say, I've been doing this for a number of years now, and every time I talk to these, teenagers, and, I interviewed a number of them who were in for murder, who, committed murder. As we talked more and kind of like that hard outer shell would kind of come down, they were children. They would talk about, I really wanted to fit in. I really wanted these shoes, or, these kids were making fun of me because of this, or, I got involved in a gang because if I didn't, I was afraid, I was going to get killed. And so what the research, again, shows us is that teenagers are more susceptible to peer pressure, and, they lack impulse control. And so when I'm, sitting in an adult prison talking to, a 19-year-old who committed this crime, 3 or 4 years ago, I don't see a hardened criminal in front of me. What I saw over and over was a child.
So going back to this current proposal where Illinois is hoping to move kids out of these jail-like facilities into residential facilities, there's also a group of young people, their families, and advocates from Northwestern University. They've launched this campaign that you mentioned in your story called the Final Five campaign. And what's the goal there with that?
Where their first thing is they want to shut down the 5 youth facilities in Illinois. So those 5 prison-like or prison, whatever term you want to use, they want to see them closed. And then they also want to make sure that, whatever replacement Illinois comes up with is small. They don't want more than, 10 youth in one setting. And they want to make sure that their families are able to actually go and visit the kids who are there, and they want to be part of the process. So they want, as Illinois is making these decisions, to be involved in those discussions since they were youth who were affected, they were in the system. And then they also really want to talk about kind of what happens next. So once the youth is let out, how are they reentered back into the community? What kind of services are they, being provided?
So they're there. Basically, they want to hold these policy makers who've announced these big goals. They want to hold them accountable on the details.
Absolutely.
Well, Duaa Eldeib of ProPublica, Illinois, I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing all the information on what's happening there in Illinois.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.